Okay, so for chapter 16, we're going to take most of the stuff we learned about for the nervous system and we're going to kind of start putting it all together. We're going to look at the sensory side, we're going to look at the motor side, and then we're going to look at how the brain and spinal cord kind of bring your peripheral nervous system into play. All right, so that's what we're going to be looking at here with chapter 16. So with chapter 16, one of the main things we need to look at is what is a sensation. Okay, so we're going to spend our first part of these notes on sensations, the sensory side, and then we will spend time on the motor side. So a sensation, guys, is a conscious or subconscious awareness of external or internal stimuli. So an external stimuli may be the heat. It's really hot outside, or if it's really cold. External stimuli may also be the wind, pain, like if you get a splinter or you stub your toe, something like that. Internal stimuli may be something on the inside where you are dehydrated, so your body is registering that there's not enough water. Okay, so there's a lot of different types of stimuli that you can detect, whether it's consciously, like you're aware that it's there, or subconsciously. Now, perception is your conscious awareness and interpretation of that sensation. Now, this is going to be different for everybody. Some people get cold a lot quicker. Some people get hot a lot quicker. A lot of times we say, oh, well, they're hot-natured. They get hot quicker than others. Some people have a very high pain tolerance. They perceive pain a little bit different than somebody else. All right, so the perception is how we actually are aware and interpret whatever sensation it might be. Now, a modality is the uniqueness of each sensation. So each sensation that we have will be very unique. It's what distinguishes one sensation from another. So it's what kind of distinguishes is temperature from pain, pressure from touch, proprioception, which is just knowing where your arms and legs are, hearing, vision, smell, the list can go on. All right, and so each modality means that each of these receptors, these sensations, are going to be distinct. They're going to be separate. Okay, so it distinguishes them. And now each sensory neuron, guys, only carries one modality. That's it. So if I have a neuron for hot temperature, it's only going to carry hot temperature. That's it. It cannot carry cold. It cannot carry pain. It cannot carry pressure. It's only going to detect when temperatures are hot or warm. Okay. On the other hand, if we have one for pain, it can only detect pain. It can't help detect for your vision, your hearing, your smell. It's only going to detect pain. So each sensory neuron is going to be specific to one type of modality. Now, because of this, with sensations, we have two kind of groups we're going to talk about. In this chapter, with chapter 16, we're going to focus more on the general senses, and then in chapter 17, we're going to talk more about the special senses. So in chapter 16, with the general senses, these can be both somatic, which means that it's like muscle or outside that we can are more aware of, or visceral, which is your internal organs. Now, with somatic, you're going to be feeling touch, thermal, which is temperature, pain, and proprioception. Okay, again, knowing where your arms and legs are, that sort of thing. Visceral is going to be with your internal organs, so they're going to detect things like pressure, stretch, when certain chemicals are present. These will also be related to like nausea, hunger, temperature, things like that. So with the special senses, that's going to be more of your smell, your taste, your vision, your hearing, and your equilibrium, which again we'll talk about in chapter 17. So guys, what I want to look at is the components of a sensation. When we detect a sensation, it's going to depend a lot of times based on what receptor it is. In this case, I wanted to show you how each of these receptors detect something different, and you'll notice that their structure is a little different. So in the first one, when you look at A up here, this is going to be a cold stimulus neuron. It detects when cold is present, and it's going to send the message down. You'll notice that it is a free nerve ending. There's no coverings on it. Whereas with B, this one's going to detect pressure. If you'll notice, it's encapsulated, so that when it's almost like a ball, when it gets flattened, that's when it feels the pressure and it sends the signal. On the other hand, with C, this one is going to be more of a chemical, when it detects chemical changes, and so this one particularly is for when we look at something like sugar, sweet, and it detects that it's sweet and it sends the message down that sugar is present. Okay, so they're just showing you that each of these neurons is for one modality. So if we look at the first one for cold stimulus, you can tell it looks different than B and C. Okay, so it's not going to be able to detect pressure. It's not going to be able to detect chemicals. It only detects cold. Okay, so that's important to note. So now let's look at the components of the sensation. A sensation has four main events that have to take place, okay, in order for you to feel or recognize that the sensation is there. The first is you have to stimulate the sensory receptor. We actually have to receive the message. So an appropriate stimulus must occur within the receptor's receptive field. All right, so there's got to be some change in the environment around the receptor. It has to occur to where it can be picked up or detected. Okay, so if I was in this video and I just was moving my mouth, but nothing was coming out, then there's no way for you to know what I was saying. Okay, so when we look at this, you have to have a way of having to detect it. There has to be a change in the environment, and that's what we have to see with these receptors. There's going to be some sort of change, whether it's a change in the temperature, a change in the chemicals, a change in the pressure, whatever that change might be. Now, once the change has taken place, we need to send the signal, okay? And remember, with neurons, they have to create what we call those action potentials. We have to send the signal down from one side of the neuron to the other side so that it can stimulate the next neuron. So this is what we would call transduction. So the first step of this is called transduction. It's transduction of the stimulus. So we see a sensory receptor must detect the change, okay, if it's pressure, cold, whatever, and it has to convert it into a graded potential. So it's got to convert it into a kind of electrical signal, okay, and we're going to use those sodium potassium pumps and things like that on the neuron that you learned back in chapter 12 in Anatomy 1. Okay, now if you recall, graded potentials, they are not action potentials yet. Okay, we have to get to a certain point. It's kind of like where you get to a certain point and then there's no going back. Once there's no going back, that's when you have the action potential. Okay, and so we see that where the graded potential is going to build up until we finally go over into the action potential, which is going to be the third phase. Once we reach that action potential phase, we've got to conduct the signal down the neuron. So the nerve sends an impulse that's carried towards the brain or the spinal cord. Okay, so this occurs when the sum of all the graded potentials, we've added them all together, which is great enough to reach that threshold, and now it sends the signal down the neuron. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at here with conduction. Then we have to actually interpret that sensation. This is integration of the sensory input. So there's going to be a region of the brain or the spinal cord that has to translate that nerve impulse into an actual sensation. So this is where it may go up to your brain and your brain says, oh, hey, that is hot. What my hand is touching is hot. On the other hand, it might be that it's like saying that the other hand is touching something that's cold. Okay, or hey, I stubbed my toe and that hurt. It's where you're actually understanding what that sensation is. Now, this occurs when a particular region of the central nervous system, that's what CNS stands for, central nervous system, integrates a number or even a variety of sensory nerve impulses together. Now, these can be conscious sensations or perceptions. However, they can also be subconscious that you don't even realize that they're happening. Okay, and changes can start taking place because of this. Okay, but there's the 4 steps. All right, we have to actually stimulate, okay, the receptor. Okay, we've got to change the environment. Then we're going to do transduction, where we're going to change that environmental change into an electrical signal that we then send down the neuron, which is conduction. And then we've got to interpret or integrate what that sensation is, and that's step number 4. Okay, so there's 4 steps. Now, if we take a look at this, guys, this happens actually very, very quickly. If we take a look here, this shows you kind of the loop. So at the top, the sensory neuron feels whatever the problem is. In this case, let's just say that it's pressure. We feel that there's pressure on your arm. It sends the signal down the sensory neuron. It goes then into the integrated system, the interneurons, where we're going to interpret the data. Okay, so we're interpreting the data here in the yellow neuron. The yellow neuron then decides what needs to happen, and it sends a signal down the blue neuron down at the bottom, which is the motor neuron, and it causes us to change it. If it's enough pressure, it may cause you to want to move your arm, okay, or brush something off if that's what the pressure might be. Okay, so this is how the sensory modality kind of works. We get the sensation, it integrates, we figure out what it is, and then we're going to decide what we're going to do with it, and it sends out the motor response. That's how we're showing that they're integrated and they're connected together. So in order to kind of discuss what a sensation is, we need to look at those different receptors, because that's the first step, is making sure the receptors detect whatever the change is. So with the sensory receptors, we need to understand that there's several classes, and these classes of receptors are going to be based either on their structure, what they look like, and also their function. Because guys, if you'll remember, anatomy and physiology, anatomy is the structure and the physiology is the function. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is the microscopic structure. This is where we're going to look at the very detailed side of the neuron. Is it a free nerve ending? When we talk about free nerve endings, that would be the example with the cold receptor in the picture, where the dendrites are just free. There's nothing covering them. They are free. On the other hand, encapsulated endings, they have a type of membrane or connective tissue wrapped around them. That's like what we saw in the pressure neuron back in the picture earlier. Okay, so for example, we have have here free neurons, or what we call bare dendrites. They lack structural specialization, and these are going to be things for pain, temperature, tickle, itch, and touch. That's what we're going to be detecting with free neurons. On the other hand, encapsulated neurons are going to be enclosed in the connective tissue, and these are going to be more for pressure, vibration, and other types of touch, like more of the, like when somebody touches your arm or something like that. Also, we see these receptors could be based on their location. So they could be put into a group based on their location where they're found. So the location of the receptors and the origin of the stimuli that they activate could determine what kind of receptor we're looking at. So one example are the external receptors. These are going to be more on the outside. External means external or outside. So they're near the external surface like your skin. On the other hand, there's interoceptors. Those are going to be inside your body. Those are going to be closer to your visceral organs. So sometimes these are also called viscoceptors because they're going to pick up the information from your viscera, which are your internal organs. Now, the type of stimulus detected could also be what kind of, based on what they're going to be named. And so we have nociceptors, or what we call for pain receptors. They're the ones that detect pain. Mechanoreceptors, they're going to detect mechanical change or movement. And so that would be something like pressure and so on, which we'll go into more detail on these in just a minute. So one thing to note about the characteristics of a sensory receptor is that they are selective. Remember, they're only going to pick up one modality. So they're very selective on what kind of information they are going to listen to and what they are going to send to the central nervous system. So each sensory receptor responds strongly to one certain kind of stimulus. Now, the same receptor may respond weakly to another type. This is why sometimes when you put your hand or something in some like an ice bath with cold, the cold is going to detect it, but those pain receptors will also weakly detect it at first, and that causes a little bit of pain with that as well. Okay, so we see that they can kind of cross a little bit, but it's going to be more of a weak type of reaction, not if it was just cold, feeling that cold that's there. Now, some receptors are what we call simple receptors. They're associated with general or somatic senses like touch, itch, tickle, pressure, vibration, temperature, pain, and proprioceptors. And these are the ones we're going to focus in on this chapter. We also have complex receptors. Complex receptors are seen more with your special senses, okay, like smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, chapter 17. Now, most sensory receptors are adaptable. Okay, adaptable means that they can actually change in their sensitivity. Okay, if it's being stimulated for a long period of time, it can then adjust to that stimulation. It can adapt to it. Okay, so an example I have here is like a hot bath. When you first put your foot in, it's really hot. It's like you can't even hardly keep your foot in it, but then you put your foot in there and it gets used to it, and then you get the rest of your body down in there and so on. And then after a while, you become less sensitive to the heat and you actually think maybe the water is getting cold. However, if somebody else came in and touched the water, they would tell you that it is hot. Okay, because your body has gotten used to it. It's adapted to it. Okay, and a lot of times you can see this because if you get out of the bathtub or whatever, your skin might be red. That's telling you, hey, it really was hot. You just got used to it. Okay, some receptors can actually adapt very quickly. This is like touch or smell. An example with the touch is like when you put your clothes on. You feel them at first, but then after a while, and they've been touching your skin a while, you don't really notice that they're there, okay, unless the tag starts bothering you or something like that. Smell also goes very fast. This is why sometimes, especially like one of the best examples is if somebody has run over a skunk, or you may have been the one that ran over a skunk, the smell is in your car and you're like, oh, it smells like skunk, but then you get used to it. And if you go pick up your friend or somebody else and they get in, they're like, oh, you ran over a skunk, they can actually still smell it because they just got in the car, whereas you got used to the smell. Okay, so when we talk about smell, it can actually adapt pretty quickly. Now, other receptors will adapt more slowly. So they're going to remain sensitive for a longer period of time. And one in particular that's really important for this is pain. We don't want pain to adapt quickly. You might think you want pain to adapt quickly. Like, I don't want to feel pain for a long period of time. The problem is, though, guys, pain is a lot of times an indication that something is wrong. It's telling your body that something is not right. And so we want the pain to be there so that you understand that we need to fix it. Don't continue to do that, okay? Or go get it checked out. That's why pain will adapt very slowly. Proprioceptors are the same way. They're going to adapt slowly because we want to always know where your arm is, your leg is, and so on. And even like blood glucose glucose. We don't want your blood glucose to adapt too quickly, because if it adapts too quickly, a diabetic will just get used to having high blood sugar, and we don't want that to occur, because then they start to have more issues. All right, so it's a slow adaptation, but it still will adapt if we're not careful. So when we look at this, guys, receptors are named according to their location. We talked about that. And so I have a word list over here, and I have some definitions. So the first one means it's located near the surface of the body. They detect changes in the external environment. So guys, these are what we would call your external receptors. These are going to be temperature, touch, vision, smell, taste, pain, so on. On the other hand, if we have visioceptors, or they're located in blood vessels or the viscera, which are the internal organs, these are going to be the interoceptors. They're inside the body. On the other hand, when we look at interoceptors, most of them are going to be unconscious. You don't realize that you're feeling it. Some examples, though, that when you do feel it is you might feel pressure or pain. Sometimes when people are starting to have a heart attack, they'll tell you that they feel a lot of pressure in their chest. Then it may turn to pain. That's where their heart is telling them that they're hurt, but they don't feel it until it's a little bit later, okay? On the other hand, these guys are located in muscles, tendons, joints, and the internal ear. They're going to detect changes in your body position, muscle tension, and they're actually going to help a lot of times with kind of balance and posture. These are the proprioceptors, okay? So make sure that you know these based on the definition. These are on location, where they're located. On the other hand, we can name these receptors based on their mode of action, what they actually detect, what do they do, okay? And so again, I have some definitions over here, and I have a word list. So if we look at the first one, these detect stretching or mechanical pressure like touch, pressure, proprioceptors, vibration, hearing, equilibrium, blood pressure would be example of this. These are mechanoreceptors. They actually detect a mechanical change, okay, like a vibration, a pressure, something like that, okay? On the other hand, the next ones detect changes in temperature. Well, this one should be super easy. This is the thermoreceptors. They're going to detect changes in temperature, whether it's hot or cold. Our next one, based on its activation, this is going to respond to painful stimuli. Now, this is the one that's a little different. You're thinking, well, why is it called a nociceptor? These are nociceptors. But guys, when you're in pain, it's normally caused by a noxious agent, meaning that it's causing damage. Okay, so nociceptors are detecting damage a lot of times to tissues. The next one, these are activated by photons of light, okay? These are only going to be located in your eye, and these are what we call photoreceptors. Guys, photo means light, and this is why if you're a photographer, you always have to have light to get a good picture. If you don't have light present, the picture just looks black, okay? So this is why light is so important to photography, but light's also important for your photoreceptors in your eye. The next one detects chemical changes in the mouth, like taste, also in the nose, like smell, and even in your body fluids, and so they're chemoreceptors. Chemo, it means chemicals. And then the last ones detect the osmotic pressure changes in your body, so like the water, and so this is the osmoreceptors. These are going to be really important in like detecting if you have enough water or if you're dehydrated. Okay, so again, just like the other ones based on location, you should be able to kind of match them up to their definition. The same thing here with your mode of action. Now, we've already talked a little bit about this adaptation process of receptors. I just want to reinforce this idea that adaptation is when the generator potential of a receptor or the receptor's potential decreases in amplitude during a sustained or constant stimulus. This is because it becomes accommodated to the response. So it's kind of like the cerebral cortex is like, hey, I already know you've told me this signal. It's not that big a deal. We'll take care of it. And some of them, again, adapt very quickly. They're rapidly adapting, where others are going to adapt more slowly. And again, it gives you some examples here. Okay, so you have the rapidly adapting versus the slowly adapting. All right, so when we're looking at general or somatic senses, we're going to look at some sensations when we talk about cutaneous sensations. Now, these are going to mostly deal with your skin. So these are receptors located in your skin, or also the subcutaneous connective tissue. So that's the layer right underneath the skin. Within your mucous membranes, like your mouth, your nose, inside your ear, and both ends of your GI tract. Okay, so when we look at this, we're looking here at those kind of sensations. Now, some body sites contain more cutaneous receptors than other sites, okay, where they're more densely or packed closer together. This is so that they can feel changes a lot quicker than in other areas. Some examples that have a lot more receptors than others are going to be like your tongue. Okay, your lips and your fingertips. I mean, think about it. A blind person, when they have to read, they use their fingers to read, right? They fill those bumps and those indentions when we talk about Braille. And you may feel those, like if you've ever gone up to a place that has like the room number as a Braille or something like that, and it doesn't feel much different to you. You don't know how to read it, okay, with your fingers, but you can feel the ridges and the changes. That's because there's more here in your fingertips than there is, say, on your forearm. Okay, or on your leg. Okay, this is also why, like, if you get a hair that's like on your arm and you can feel that it's there, but you can't locate it, okay, and then it kind of goes away, and then you're like, okay, you get busy again, and then you feel it again because it moved. You're like, oh, where is that hair? Those areas don't have as many receptors. They're spread out, okay? So it's kind of like, if you think about it in the sense of like in a big city, like New York, LA, your bigger cities in whatever state you live in, all of the people are kind of packed close together, so their density is close. That would be like in your fingertips, your tongue, and your lips, okay? Whereas like where we are in New Mexico, if you've ever been to Hobbs or been around in southern New Mexico, people are pretty spread out, okay? Yes, in the city they're close together, but they're pretty spread out. People can live miles away from each other. Their nearest neighbor might be 3 or 4 miles away. And so because of that, they're more spread out. And that would be like the receptors in your forearm or like in your thigh. Okay, they're spread out more. They're still there, but they're spread out more, okay, giving more room. And they may not pick up the sensation as quickly because they're not as densely packed together. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here with the idea of there being in some places extra receptors versus others. Now, when you look at cutaneous receptors, the dendrites of sensory neurons, they can be free, like in this picture. Okay, this is, we're showing you free nerve endings, or they could be encapsulated or covered with connective tissue, like we see a lot of times with those pressure neurons. Now, this is how they communicate. Remember, we talked about how there's going to be kind of that loop area where we're going to detect the message. This is by the cutaneous receptor. It detects that there's a change. It's then going to do transduction and conduction, where it's going to send the impulse. This is through a nerve impulse, and it's going to go through what we call the somatic efferent neuron, meaning it's going to go towards the central nervous system. This means it's going to enter into a spinal nerve or a cranial nerve. Okay, so it's going to enter through a spinal nerve or a cranial nerve, depending on where it's located. It's then going to travel through the thalamus, okay, because remember the thalamus is the switchboard. It's going to send it where it needs to go. And then it's going to ultimately, because these are for sensations from your skin, go to the somatosensory area of the parietal lobes. So remember, the parietal lobes are here, the somatosensory area is here. That's part of your cerebral cortex. This is where then it's going to say, hey, I was touched on my shoulder. Okay, or I feel that there is pressure on my right foot. That's where this is going to go, and it's going to then interpret the data or information that came in from that receptor. So when we look at this, we're looking mostly kind of at different types of touch when we're talking about the skin. So guys, here when we're talking about tactile sensations, we're talking about mostly the touch with the skin. So these are touch sensations. They're due to the stimulation of tactile receptors in the upper levels of your skin, and most of these are going to be types of mechanoreceptors. Now, in this picture over here, you're going to notice that this is very similar to what you saw in the skin chapter. Okay, you saw that we have the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer, and there's different levels in this layer of skin that you're going to find different neurons, and they're labeled here. You have the Merkel disc, the Messner corpuscle, the Rufian corpuscle, the hair root plexus, which is going to be the nerve that's wrapped around the hair root, and then you have the Pansian corpuscle, that's for the deeper part. And you can see that they're located at different levels, and you can see that they have different structures. So let's take a look at these. Also, guys, this picture, if you again have the 14th edition of the book, is found on page 551. Okay, so let's take a look at these. Now, one thing to note when we're talking about touch is there's kind of two different ways we can kind of define touch. The first type of touch is called crude touch. This is your ability to perceive that something has touched the skin, but you don't know what it is. You just know that you have been touched. Okay, that's crude touch. On the other hand, there's discriminative touch. This is your ability to recognize the exact point on your body that has been touched, and a lot of times it's also you being able to recognize what touched you as well. Okay, what has touched you in that specific spot. Okay, so you have crude touch versus discriminative touch. So the first receptor we want to look at are called the Messner's or Meissner's corpuscles. So the Meissner's corpuscles are the corpuscles of touch. They're a mass of dendrites surrounded by connective tissue, so these are encapsulated. They're located in the dermal papillae, okay, so they're in the dermal layer of your skin. Now these guys do adapt very rapidly. They lose their sensitivity to a stimulus very quickly, and this involves a type of discriminative touch. Now, these guys are going to be very concentrated in certain areas of your body, like your fingertips, your palms, so the palm of your hand, the soles of your feet, your eyelids, and the tip of your tongue. Now, they're going to be located throughout your skin, but they're going to be more densely packed in these particular areas that are listed. Now, the next we want to look at is the hair root plexus. These are dendrites in networks around the hair follicles. They are going to detect movement of the hair shaft. Okay, so when the hair moves, that's what they're going to detect. So these receptors detect movement along the skin surface, and this is going to be more of your crude touch. Okay, not as much of your discriminative touch. These guys will also adapt very rapidly as well. Okay, so they're a rapidly adapting receptor. The next ones are called the Merkel discs. Merkel discs are also known as type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. They're flattened dendrites, okay, so they're more flattened out. They're near the stratum basal, so they're right up against that bottom layer of the epidermis of your skin, okay, that base layer. These are a little more slowly adaptive. They're going to remain sensitive to a stimulus longer than we saw in the other examples so far. And these guys are involved in discriminative touch as well. There's also what we call the type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. These are also known as Rufian corpuscles. They're located a little bit deeper in the dermis. They're not up real close to the epidermis. They're deeper. They're going to detect more heavy and or continuous touch. Okay, so they're going to detect it if it's a stronger touch, it's heavier, or if it's even more continuous. These are going to be more slowly adapted. They're going to remain sensitive to stimulus longer as well compared to others we've seen. So your type 1 and type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors are going to adapt more slowly. All right, now this brings us more towards our pressure. Now, pressure sensation is a stimulus of tactile receptors that are deeper in the tissues, okay? Because touch is one thing where it kind of goes against your skin. That's why you can feel light touch. Pressure is another when you're pushing, okay, on something, when something's pressing on you. So pressure is a longer lasting effect than touch normally is. It also is felt over a larger area, okay? It's not necessarily felt in this one area. When you put pressure on something, you're going to feel it in a larger area. So one of the examples of these are the type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors, but then more specifically, they're not the Rufian example that we saw on the last slide. They're what we call Pansian corpuscles. These are lamellated corpuscles, meaning they're wrapped around with connective tissue. But one thing that's unique about them is a lot of times we talk about the neuron looking like this, where you have the dendrites and then you have the cell body and you have then the axon. This one's different. It has one dendrite. Okay, this one dendrite is wrapped around with the connective tissue. We have the cell body and then you have the axon. Okay, so this is what makes them a little bit different. These guys are also going to, when they detect pressure, they're more rapidly adapting. They're going to adapt pretty quickly, lose their sensitivity pretty quickly for this pressure. Our next example when we're talking about sensations are thermal sensations. The receptors here, guys, they're not covered or wrapped in connective tissue. They're made of free nerve endings. Some of these thermal receptors will respond to heat, whereas others are going to respond to cold. So they don't respond to hot and cold. It's going to be hot or cold. Okay, they're not going to respond to the other type. Okay, so you're going to have cold receptors throughout your body and you're going to have hot receptors throughout your body. We also then see pain receptors. Pain receptors are a vital sensation. You're like, oh, but pain, it's so annoying. Why is it vital? It's super important because it's your alert system. It's to let you know that damage has occurred. Okay, so this is going to be like your early alert type system to damage that's present. These are called nociceptors. Nociceptors are pain receptors and they are also free nerve endings. They're not covered with any kind of connective tissue. They're located in nearly every tissue in your body. Okay, so almost every tissue in your body has pain receptors located there. And the reason they're there is so that they can detect tissue damage. When the tissue gets damaged, whether it's by bacteria or a tear or a cut or whatever the process might be where the tissue has been damaged, it's going to release chemicals. That damaged tissue is going to release chemicals, which then stimulates the nociceptor. The nociceptor then lets the body know that there's damage there, but that's also where the pain comes from. These have little or no adaptation. They're going to remain sensitive for a very long period of time. Now, they may dull a little bit if you've ever had a kind of pain that was more sharp and that sort of thing, but then it dulled out to an ache. However, then you hit that area again, or you knocked it on something, then it brought that sharp pain back. That's because these receptors don't ever really adapt, okay? They may dull the sensation where you're only feeling like a throb or pain like that until you hit it again or something like that, but those sensations never fully go away if there's still tissue damage present. Now, there are different types of pain that we want to talk about. The first type of pain is called acute pain. This is where you have sharp, fast pain. This is felt in a very localized area. The message is carried by large diameter myelinated neurons. So when we look at this, it means that the neuron has a large diameter. They're larger neurons, and they're not this big. I'm just kind of showing you a comparison. They're large, okay, and they're myelinated. If you remember, when they're myelinated, that means they're insulated, so they can send the signal a lot faster. It's like the signal jumps from one node to another, and the signal can get there a lot quicker. This is the acute pain. So this is a real sharp pain. So this might be if you've ever taken like a breath in and you got that really sharp pain in your side, that might be what we talk about more with acute pain. On the other hand, there's what we call chronic pain. Chronic pain is a slower pain, and it will gradually increase over time. It starts a lot of times as an aching or throbbing. However, it can escalate into a more excruciating pain later with chronic pain. The message is carried on smaller diameter. So if acute pain was large diameter, these are going to be smaller diameter. They are also unmyelinated neurons. They don't have that myelination, so it takes it longer to get the message there. Okay, and so then when the next message comes through, that's why it's more of a gradual increase. Okay, it's not fast. It's not going to travel as quickly. Now, when I say it's not fast, guys, I mean it's not split second that you feel the pain. Okay, it's going to gradually get there, and it's going to maybe gradually increase in pain. We also see that there's a type of pain that's called superficial somatic pain. This is due to a sensation of nociceptors in the skin. So if you skinned your knee or you cut your finger when you were cooking or something like that, these are going to be your superficial somatic pain receptors that detect this. On the other hand, we also have deep somatic pain. This is a sensation of nociceptors that are more in your muscles, your tendons, and your joints. This might be if you have joint pain due to like a athletic injury, or you tore a tendon or something like that. The pain is deeper, okay? It's not on the surface. It's a little bit deeper in the muscles, but it's still somatic pain, okay? But it is a deeper pain. We also see that there's what we call visceral pain. Visceral pain is the stimulation of nociceptors of the visceral organs, which are your internal organs like your liver, your heart, your kidneys, your stomach, that sort of thing. And then this brings us to what we call referred pain. You may have heard about referred pain. This is a lot of times with visceral pain, pain of an internal organ. You usually feel the pain on the skin covering that organ, not the actual organ itself. You're not actually registering that your liver hurts or your heart hurts. Okay, it's going to be the skin around that area that you actually kind of feel the pain. And what happens with this is that the cerebral cortex a lot of times will incorrectly identify the area of where the pain's coming from. So it's like it thinks that the skin there is damaged, but it's actually the organ underneath the skin. Now, usually the area which is served by the same segment of spinal cord nerves, that's where you're going to end up feeling that pain. So the example here is a heart attack. A lot of times when people have a heart attack, they talk about how they'll have pain in their chest, okay, right over where the heart is, but they'll also have pain down their left arm. Now, the reason for this is because the same nerves that come out of T1 through T5, that's thoracic 1 through thoracic 5 of your spinal cord, they service the heart, but they also service that left arm. Okay, and so this is why you get pain a lot of times down that left arm in a heart attack. It's referred. It's referring it to a different area than where the pain originated from. The last one here is called a phantom pain. Phantom pain is a sensation of pain from somebody who has an amputated limb. So they've lost their foot, but they have an itch on that foot. They feel that there's an itch there even though the foot's not present. Or they have a pain or a tickle or a pressure on that area, but that area is not present anymore. But guys, the nerve still is. Wherever it has been amputated, the nerve is still there that would connect to the spinal cord. It's just been cut short. So if it gets stimulated, it can cause phantom pain. So this is where the brain receives impulses from the remaining proximal ends of those sensory neurons, and normally it's an itch, tingling, or pressure. It can ultimately become pain too as well, but we see that a lot of times it's more of an annoying type of stimulus, like a itch or tingle that's there. Now, before we move on, I wanted to kind of talk about referred pain real quick before we go. This is a graphic that kind of shows you where referred pain is located a lot of times on the body. This is found on page 552. So if you look at the heart here in the example, you'll see that it's right over the heart in the chest, but it's also down the left arm. You can see it right there down the left arm in the diagram. You'll also look, if you look at the kidney, where the kidney is located, this is kind of a yellowish color. It's actually a large area. This is why somebody who has like kidney stones or a kidney infection, it's their low back may hurt. It may spread into their groin area, down closer to their bladder. It can end up being a lot in a lot of areas. So guys, this diagram is just showing you that referred pain can be in different areas. Some make sense, like of course the heart and the kidneys, and others you're like, why is there pain there? I mean, look at where you can have some pain for your liver and gallbladder. Of course you can have it in the area that the liver and gallbladder is on the side, but you can also have it up here in your neck and your shoulder. Okay, and so sometimes you're thinking, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that's why a lot of times when we go to the doctor, they want to know where your pain's located, because this might help them understand that if, okay, of an internal organ or a muscle issue. Now, when we look at nociception or pain, there's two main groups. There's fast pain and slow pain. Fast pain is what we also call the acute pain. It's localized. It moves very rapidly over large diameter nerves, and those nerves are myelinated. And a lot of times we call them myelinated A fibers. On the other hand, with slow pain, it begins after a stimulus is applied, and it gradually will increase in intensity over time. Now, this could take several seconds, or it could take several minutes. It could take a week, where you finally are then in excruciating pain, but it's a slower process. The reason it's slower is that the diameter of these neurons are smaller, and they're also unmyelinated, and we call these C fibers. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here when you look at fast pain versus slow pain. So let me give you an example. Fast pain would be like if you cut, like if you were cutting an onion and you cut your finger, that's a fast pain. Whereas a toothache might be a slow pain. It starts as more of a dull ache or a burning, a throbbing, and then eventually it can become excruciating pain. It was slow and it was over time. So before we move on and we look at some other issues or areas in this chapter, I want to talk to you about pain relief, because there's different ways that we can relieve pain, because we don't like to be in pain. One, of course, is anesthesia. This blocks the sensation of pain or touch. It doesn't allow the message to reach the brain at all. It sends the message, but it doesn't get to the brain. Now, there's two ways this can happen. You can go under general anesthetic. This is going to remove all of your sensations. Okay, so this is what they do whenever you go in for like a major surgery. They're going to put you under, and this removes all your sensations, and it causes you to be unconscious. Okay, so you're in a state of unconsciousness. On the other hand, we can also have spinal anesthesia. They call this like a spinal block or maybe an epidural. This removes all the sensations below where it's injected. Okay, and this is going to be injected into the subarachnoid space around that area of the spinal cord. So anything below that area where this has been injected should go numb. You shouldn't feel it, and it may remove certain sensations. An epidural, guys, will remove the pain part, but it doesn't remove the pressure. This allows the woman to know when to push, because the epidurals you normally get when you're in labor. Okay. On the other hand, we also have analgesia. Now, this is going to be the type of medication that we normally would take for pain. This decreases or blocks the sensation of pain, and it can do it a number of ways. It can block the production of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are those chemicals that actually stimulate the nociceptor. So we could stop them from stimulating the pain receptor. So it stops the process altogether. On the other hand, it can also block the impulse being conducted. So step 1 and step 2 happen. So the neuron detects the signal, and it transducts it into a chemical signal or into a electrical signal, but it doesn't conduct it down the neuron. So it's blocked this way. Another way that this type of medication can work is it can change your perception of the pain in the brain. It could work on the brain if it can cross that blood-brain barrier, and it can change how you perceive the pain, so it doesn't feel as intense. Now, this depends on the type of medications, but these medications can be as simple as like Tylenol, Motrin, things like that, but they could also be a higher dosage and concentration if you look more at like hydrocodone or something like that. Okay, and so this is what we're talking about with like painkillers. Another type of receptor that's really important are the proprioceptive receptors or sensations. These are located in skeletal muscles, and they're found in what we call spindle fibers, and you can see them here in this picture. These spindle fibers a lot of times are going to wrap around the muscle in a certain kind of way where they're going to detect the muscle's tone, detect the muscle's movement, things like that. We also see that there's going to be things called like tendon organs. These are going to be found in the tendons. We also see kinesthetic receptors, which are going to be in and around a joint, so they're going to detect movement because kinesthetic means movement, and they're going to detect that, as well as the inner ear. And all of this is going to help with your balance, your posture, and your muscle tone. All right, so guys, on this particular slide, it kind of has a summary chart for you. This is table 16.2 out of your book. It is found on page 555. You'll see the types of receptors. You'll also look at their structure and location, like what kind of structure they have, their location. What do they sense? Do they sense things like itching or tickling? Do they sense pain? Do they sense touch? And then it also tells you whether they adapt slow or fast. Okay, and so this kind of gives you almost all the information we've talked about and kind of put it more in one chart. All right, so we've detected the signal. We detected that there's an issue, that the environment around the receptor has changed. How do we get that signal up to the brain so that the brain can interpret it and know what to do next? Okay, this is going to be important to see that there's a set of steps or neurons that these have to go through. So the first step is called the first order neurons. These are going to conduct the impulses from the receptor. They are going to conduct the impulses from the receptor either into the brainstem if they're coming from cranial nerves, okay, up here, or into the spinal cord. So if they're from your if they're the spinal nerves, they're going to go into the spinal cord. Okay, so there's two ways we can enter into the central nervous system, and this is the first order neuron. Okay, and you can see it located here. Now the second order neuron is going to take this information and it's going to travel up to the thalamus. So the second order neuron is going to conduct the impulse, the information, and it's going to take it through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, and up into the thalamus. This is where the neurons then do what we call desiccate, meaning that they're going to switch sides, cross to the opposite side of the body. So this is why you can detect what really happens is you're going to detect the sensations over here on your right side. They're detecting the sensations that are taking place on the left side of your body and vice versa. Okay, so they're detecting the information from the opposite side. And you can see the second order neuron here. Then we have the third order neuron. The third order neuron is going to take the message or the impulse from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area of the cortex. So it's going to take it to the area that it needs to go to be interpreted. Did the sensation come from your tongue? Did it come from your toe? Did it come from your knee? It's going to send it to that particular area, and this is the third order neuron. So these should not be that hard to remember. The first order takes the message from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord or the cranial nerve, okay, so the brainstem. On the other hand, then a second order neuron is going to carry the information to the thalamus, and then the third order is going to take it from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So it has three neurons that are part of the getting the information to your brain. And here's the third order neuron located here. Now, how do we get the information up here? There's some pathways, guys. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these pathways, okay? But I do want you to see that there's a number of ways that this information can travel depending on what kind of information it is and where it's coming from in your body. So this first example are called the posterior column tracts. Now, posterior means back, so these are at the back part of the spinal cord, and you can see them pulled out here in the blue in the picture. These posterior column tracts are going to carry impulses for proprioception, discriminative touch, pressure, and vibrations. So they're going to take that information. Now there's two tracts we want to talk about here in this posterior column. So the first one's the cutinate fasciculus. This is the nerve impulses that will be coming from your upper limbs, so your arms and legs, your upper chunk, like your chest, your neck, and the back part of your head, the posterior part of your head. They're going to send the signals to your brain through this particular column. Okay, and you can see it located here in the picture. On the other hand, we have the gracile fascicularis. This one is where nerve impulses from your lower trunk, like your abdomen, and your lower limbs, your legs, are going to send their information up this tract. So we have these two tracts coming up, bringing either proprioception, discriminative touch, pressure, or vibration from different areas of your body. We also see that the next one's called the spinal thematic tract. There's a lateral and anterior column. So anterior means front, so it's a front column, you can see here in the picture. And then you have the lateral, it's towards the side. They're going to carry impulses to your cerebral cortex for things like pain, temperature, itch, and tickle. So if you'll notice, they carry different information. They're still carrying the information from your limbs, your trunk, your neck, and the back part of your head, but they're carrying different information as pain, temperature, itch, and tickle. Okay, and they are, of course, taking it to the primary sensory motor cortex on the opposite side of your brain on that parietal lobe. The next one's called, so the next one's the trigeminothomatic tract. This carries nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, itch, and tickle, but it's going to bring it from your face region. Okay, so these cranial nerves that are talking to your face, your nasal cavity, so when you get that tickle in your nose, your oral cavity for your mouth, and also your teeth. So any kind of information that's coming from the front part of your head, the anterior part of your head, is going to take this tract. And they are going to, again, of course, take it to the thalamus, which then is going to take it to the particular or appropriate region within the sensory motor cortex on the opposite side. All right, so again, when we look at these, you're going to see that they each carry a little bit different information, and they're carrying it from different places in the body. The next one's called the spinocerebellar pathway or tract. These are going to be anterior and posterior, and if you'll notice, they're on the sides. Anterior means front, posterior means back. These guys are only going to carry proprioception. They're going to carry it from your trunk and your lower limbs. They're going to carry from one side of the body to the same side of the body. Now, this is what's unique here. In every other tract, we have seen that they have crossed over to the opposite side. Okay, so what I'm feeling on my left side of my body is being interpreted by the right side of my brain. What I'm feeling on the right side of my body is being interpreted on the left side of my brain. In this particular case with the spinocerebellar, that is not what's happening. My right side is going to be interpreted by the right side of the cerebellum. The left side is going to be interpreted by the left side of the cerebellum. Now, the whole point of this tract is to allow for coordination, posture, and balance. Okay, that's why they're detecting proprioception. Okay, and they're going to be going only on the same side, and this is what's unique about this one. Now, the somatic sensory pathway we see here is the somatic sensory nerves are not distributed evenly through the body, and we've looked at this when we looked at the homunculus that's here. Remember, homunculus means little man, and he's disproportionate. Okay, he's not put together like he should be. The hand is a lot larger, the lips are a lot larger, and this is because they contain a higher density number of receptors compared to the other parts of the body. All right, and so I wanted to again show you the sensory homunculus here that's found on your cerebral cortex on the parietal lobe of your brain. All right, so now we want to switch gears and we want to go to the motor side. So the first part of this was talking about the sensory. Now we want to look at the motor. So motor activity, we got the message up to the brain, and now we know that there's pain down in your foot. Well, what are we going to do with that information? What kind of motor activity is going to happen because of the information that came in? So motor activity begins in the primary motor area. If you remember, it's right next to the primary sensory area in the brain. Okay, so when we look at this, the motor homunculus, which we'll talk about, so if you recall, the motor homunculus was kind of the same way, that certain areas are going to have more receptors or more signals being sent to those muscles versus others based on what kind of movement needs to take place. But when we look at this, guys, with movement, we're going to see that there are going to be two main neurons that are going to be our issue. In sensory, we saw there was first order, second order, third order. That's sensory. In motor, we're going to see upper and lower. So any motor neuron that is not directly responsible for stimulating a muscle, okay, it's not talking directly to the muscle, which means this neuron is found in your central nervous system, okay, your brain or your spinal cord. This is called an upper motor neuron, or a UMN, an upper motor neuron. Okay, now these connect the brain to the appropriate level in the spinal cord. So if I want to talk to my foot because I stubbed my toe and I want to make sure that I acknowledge that, and I'm going to grab it with my hand or whatever, these upper motor neurons are going to communicate that and allow me to move in that particular direction. They are going to talk to the lower motor neurons. Okay, they're going to talk to the lower motor neurons. So all these excitatory inhibitory signals that are coming from the upper motor neurons, okay, they're going to go talk to the second neuron, which is called the lower motor neurons. Okay, so these are going to be the LMNs. They are going to go and talk directly to a skeletal muscle. Okay, whether it's your bicep, your tricep, your ab muscles, whatever it's going to be that they're going to talk to, they're going to go talk to a specific muscle. Since only your lower motor neurons provide the output from the central nervous system to skeletal muscle fibers, they're also called the final common pathway, because they're going to be the one that finally talks, that's the final part, to a skeletal muscle. And over here you have kind of a flow chart that shows you. You have the sensory motor association cortex, okay, the information came into your brain that this is happening, something is happening. The motor centers in your brainstem are going to get the message to do something. These are the upper motor neurons. They're going to send the message down to the lower motor neuron, and once they hit the lower motor neuron, they're going to talk directly to the skeletal muscle. That's why you see there's only one pathway here. On all the others, there was multiple pathways to get there, but the lower motor neuron can only talk to the skeletal muscle. Nobody else can. Okay, so that's important to note. That's why they're called the final common pathway. Now, when we look at the motor side has two ways to get the information down to the muscle. And the first way is what we call the direct tracts or pathways. These are also called the pyramidal tracts. They're going to travel through those pyramids that we talked about earlier in chapter 14. They're going to carry nerve impulses for more precise voluntary movement from the cerebral cortex. So this is going to be a conscious awareness that you are telling your body to move in a certain way. Now, these axons of the lower motor neurons extend through either cranial nerves to the skeletal muscles of the face or head, or through spinal nerves to innervate the skeletal muscle that they're talking to in the limbs and the trunk. Okay, so they're either going to leave in the cranial nerves and talk to your face, okay, or they're going to leave through the spinal nerves at the particular level and talk to those muscles in that area. Now, there's two major tracts of lower motor neurons that we want to talk about, and they're shown in this diagram. Now, these are actually what we would consider one track, because they're called the corticospinal tracts. There's just a lateral one, which means they're on the side, and you can see it here in the picture, and then there's an anterior one. Now, the lateral corticospinal tracts are responsible for precise, agile, and higher skilled movements of like your hands and your feet. Okay, so this is the whole idea of being able to move your hands in like right. Okay, it's going to be the lateral corticospinal tract, or tie your shoes, where it's more precise movements. On the other hand, the anterior corticospinal tracts control movements of the trunk and the proximal parts of the limbs, like your bicep, your quadricep, and hamstrings of your legs, because those are going to be more gross movements or large movements. They're not as precise. Okay, and so when we look at this, this is the anterior corticospinal tracts, but both of them are going to help with movement in those areas, okay, in either your trunk or your lower body, or your limbs, so your trunk or your limbs. So if we're looking at the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts, you can see them located here in these pictures. The first one is showing you the lateral and how information leaves from the brain, the cerebral cortex, and it comes down. If you'll notice, there's still a crossing over that takes place, and they're traveling through the pyramid that is found in the medulla area. Okay, the same thing over here on the anterior. It's going to travel through the pyramid, and it still does a crossing over. It just does it down here towards the bottom. Okay, so again, just like with the sensation, the left side of my brain is going to sense the information from the right side of my body. It's also going to send the information to the right side of my body to cause it to move. So there's still a crossing over that takes place here. If you'll also notice that it bypasses the thalamus. The thalamus is kind of this structure here that you can see in both pictures, and it bypasses that. The thalamus is only important in helping with the sensory side, okay, of the information. Now, the second pathway we want to look at that's part of this direct pathway are called the corticobubular pathways. This is going to be where impulses are going to be for the control of your skeletal muscles in the head. So these are going to be more for your cranial nerves, and that's why it's called the corticobubular, because the information is going to leave through the medulla. It's not going to actually go through the pyramids, okay, because it doesn't go further down in the spinal cord. It's going to leave before that point. And so these are going to be for your cranial nerves, which help you with the facial expressions, saliva, chewing, those types of things. Okay, so the corticobubular pathway. We also want to see that there's what we call indirect pathways. These are the extrapyramidal tracts. They're outside the pyramids. There are lateral and anterior columns, which you can see here. And if you'll notice, they're a lot smaller and they kind of fill in spaces. They're going to take nerve impulses for involuntary movements. Okay, so where you're not really aware of those movements. Also muscle tone, posture, balance. The whole idea of keeping your balance while you're sitting or standing. These are the areas that are going to help compensate that just if you start swaying or things like that. One way you can really see these work is if you stand on one foot with your eyes closed. If you do that, you can actually feel your body compensating to help you with your balance. That compensation of the movement of your foot, your ankle, and your leg is going to come through these indirect tracts that we're going to look at. Now again, I don't expect you to memorize these tracts, but you do need to know that there's direct and indirect, and what does that mean? So the indirect pathways, there's 5 major tracts we'll look at. There's what we call the rubospinal. This is going to be precise voluntary movements of the distal parts of your upper limb. So distal means the far end of your upper limb, so this is going to be more of like your fingers, your wrists, okay? The tectospinal is the reflexory of your head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual or auditory stimulus. So this is when something like flies at your face, okay, something is coming at you and you see it and you move, okay, it's a reflex. The same thing if you hear a buzzing around your ear and you do this with your arm or you move out of the way, that's going to be more of a reflex. We also see the vestibulospinal. This is going to help you maintain posture and balance in response to your head moving. So when you move your head quickly out of the way, it's to help you keep your balance so you don't fall over. Or like ballerinas, when they move their head and whip it around, but their body is moving in a different way, it helps them be able to keep their balance. This is the vestibulospinal. We also see that the last 2 are the lateral and medial rectilospinal. These are going to maintain posture and regulating muscle tone in response to ongoing body movements like walking or riding a bike where you're moving in a continuous way. It's going to help you coordinate all of that and maintain your posture and your balance through those movements that are continuous. Okay, so these are what we would be the indirect. Now, if you'll notice though, the indirect is going to work with the direct pathways. Okay, it's going to help the direct pathways in helping you keep your balance and your posture and all that stuff while they're working and doing their job as well. Now guys, one thing in this PowerPoint that I don't really cover is that you need to take a look at the parts in the book that talk about the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. These are located in your book, so read that section. If you have the 14th edition, these are found on page 564 through 566. Now, to kind of end this lecture, I want to talk to you a little bit about sleep, and I want to talk to you a little bit about memory. All right, so let's look at sleep first. Sleep and wakefulness, these are also integrative functions with the cerebrum. It's controlled by the reticular activating system, which we talked about in chapter 14. This is called the RAS. The reticular formation are patches of gray matter, which means they're cell bodies scattered in the white matter of the brainstem, spinal cord, and diencephalon. The portion of the reticular formation known as the RAS is going to be your alerting system for you to wake up. Okay, so in the morning, whenever your alarm goes off and you hear that, and it's going to activate the RAS to get you to start waking up. Now, this doesn't mean you like necessarily pop out of bed and you're all happy and ready to go. Okay, because some people are morning people and some people aren't, but it's the whole idea of kind of turning your brain back on. It's waking you up. Okay, that's what this area does. It may be light. Somebody comes in and turns the light on in your room. Okay, or the sun starts coming in through the window. Okay, and you can detect that even with your eyes closed. You can tell that it's gotten lighter. Okay, this is waking you up. Hopefully you don't wake up from pain, but that can happen. If something painful gets you, it may wake you up. Like in our area, it could be like a scorpion or something like that. Okay, or it could be touch if somebody comes and touches you to wake you up, or you get cold because somebody pulled off your covers. Whatever the sensation might be, this area is going to detect it and cause you to start waking up and waking your brain up. When the RAS is stimulated by nociceptors, that's pain, touch, proprioceptor signals. Let's just say you had the dream you were falling, okay, and it causes you to like jump. Okay, you feel that bright light or sound. It's going to send the impulses to the thalamus. These are going to be dispersed to the proper area in the cerebral cortex. So then the RAS is responsible for arousing you from your deeper sleep. Okay. It also is important in helping you stay awake and conscious throughout the day. Now, of course, there are times when you're really tired and stuff like that. This area will start to shut down your brain, and you may start falling asleep even though it's the middle of the day and you don't want to. Okay, but this area is going to be in control of helping keep you more awake in your wakefulness. So now let's look at the sleep side of it. So during sleep, the activity of the RAS is very low. It kind of shuts down in a sense. Now, it doesn't shut down completely. It just means it's kind of like on autopilot on the lowest setting, okay? It's not going to be doing a whole lot. So what is sleep? Sleep is a state of altered consciousness or partial unconsciousness. Now, it doesn't mean complete unconsciousness. That would be a coma, okay? Because if you're sleeping, you can still be aroused. It may just take a while to wake you up if you're in a deep sleep, okay? Now, there are some neurotransmitters that are in your nervous system which cause sleep. These are serotonin and norepinephrine. So if these neurotransmitters are not being produced like they should in your brain, it can affect your sleep cycle. Each is produced by specific nuclei in your brain stem. Now, there's two types of normal sleep we want to talk about. The first type of normal sleep is called non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM. This is your slow wave sleep, and there's 4 stages that you go through in this non-rapid eye movement, okay? When we look at the 4 stages, the first stage So when we look at these stages, the first stage is called the transitional stage. This is when your body is getting ready to go to sleep. So you haven't actually really fallen asleep yet, but you're transitioning into sleep. Your brain is starting to kind of shut down a little bit. You're getting into that sleep stage. Number 2 is your light sleep. You're lightly sleeping, but you could easily be woken up here. Stage 3 is going to be moderate sleep, okay? And then stage 4 is the deep sleep. So now when we look at this time-wise, when you're looking at transitional, light, and moderate sleep, okay, they are going to all kind of be around about an hour, and then go into that deep sleep. Once you're in deep sleep, this can allow you to enter into your second type of sleep, which is REM sleep. This is your rapid eye movement sleep. And it gets the name because technically underneath your eyelids, your eyes are going to be moving rapidly during this time. This is where most of your dreaming will occur. Your brain actually has a very high consumption of oxygen during this time in the REM stage, because this is when you are dreaming, and sometimes they can be very vivid where you feel like they're actually real. That's really happening. Okay, so that's what we're looking at with the REM. So if we look at kind of the pathway that this takes, so first you have to go to sleep, and that's going to be your 4 stages in your non-rapid eye movement. Okay, so that's the 4 stages going from transition, light, moderate to deep sleep. So about every 90 minutes you go into that, go from non-REM sleep into REM sleep. Your REM period then occurs. Now, REM periods only last for a short period of time, okay? So at first it may only last for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something like that, and then you go back into non-REM. Now, normally you don't go all the way back into the transitional or light. You may go into moderate and deep sleep, okay? You may not go completely back out of it, but you'll go into more of that lighter sleep. Then you'll go through a period of 90 more minutes, and then you'll enter REM again. This will then last longer than the previous one. So if the first one was 10 minutes, the second one may be 20 minutes, and so on. And each time you go into a REM cycle, it will be longer to where to where the longest REM is normally about 50 minutes long. Okay, so it'll build up to that point as you go through the process of sleep. Now, in your textbook, it talks about when sleep gets altered, when we look at things like narcolepsy, being in a coma, sleep apnea, insomnia. You should take a look at those and read about those particular sleep disorders. All right, the last thing I want to talk to you about with this integrative function is memory. And so when we look at memory, one thing we need to look at is learning. Learning is your ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction or experience. And a lot of times it comes with both. Okay, you get instruction about it, and then you have to practice it, and you actually have to experience it a lot of times to remember it or learn it. Okay, when we're looking at this. Learning is going to lead to memory. Memory is the process by which that information that you just learned through instruction or experience is going to be stored. Now, it's not good enough just to store it in your brain. You also need to be able to retrieve it. You need to be able to find it in your brain and actually utilize it. This is where the application portion comes from, your learning. Okay? It's one thing to have a lot of knowledge. Okay, knowledge is just knowing a lot of stuff. But if you can apply that knowledge, a lot of times we call that wisdom. Okay, where you're using that knowledge to do something with it. Okay, but you have to be able to access it. You have to be able to get to it, and that's what memory is. So how does the brain do this? Well, guys, our brain has a ability to be what we call where it has what we call plasticity. Plasticity is the capability for change, and this is associated with learning. So it actually changes. Your brain will change structurally, what it looks like, and functionally as you learn stuff. Okay, and so this actually happens very quickly as kids. We actually see that their brain from when they're a baby until about 5 years old changes greatly, and they learn a lot of stuff during that time. I mean, think about it. They learn how to walk, they learn how to talk, they learn how to eat different things, they learn a lot of different information. This is why kids ask you why all the time when they're a toddler. They're learning different things, and their brain is changing. So if you did scans every year of a child's brain early on, you would see that it is changing. Okay, this is also why some people, we talked about brain lateralization in chapter 14, where they may be more right side brained or left side brained. You might actually see that one side is a little larger of their brain versus the other due to this plasticity, due to which one they use more often. Okay, so it's that ability to change. Now, as we get older, it's harder to do this. Okay, it's harder for the brain to do this. However, there are times when people have like strokes, where a part of their brain gets damaged and it no longer works, okay? And it could be in the area, say, for speech. Well, after they go to speech therapists and they work on it, after a time, they may be able to talk, maybe not as well as they did before, but it did change. This is where the brain has rerouted around the damaged area and still allowed you to have that skill. It may not be as good, but you still have that skill. That's what plasticity allows you to do. And that's a very important structure, very important ability that the brain has, because the brain cells cannot regenerate. Once they're gone, they're gone. However, maybe we can reroute around the damaged area. Now, there are different types of memory. Now, the first type of memory is called immediate memory. This is an extremely short memory. This memory, if you don't continue to recite something, will only last a few seconds, okay? And so this a lot of times happens like when you have to look up a phone number or something like that, and you're like, hey, remember this number, and you say it, and if you don't say it again, it's gone, okay? That's immediate memory. You want to you got to use it right away or it's gone. The next level is short-term memory. This lasts longer than immediate, but it's still short-lived. This will only be a couple of minutes, okay? You'll only be able to remember it for a couple of minutes. This is all well and good when you're doing certain tasks, but like for this class, you don't want immediate and short-term memory. You want to take this information that hopefully you're learning and you want to put it into long-term memory. Long-term memory this is what we want. It's going to transfer the information from the short term to the long term, and we do this by a number of ways. One way is through rehearsal, going over and over again. This is why people, when they learn lines like for a play or for like a TV show or a movie, they recite the lines over and over and over. They're rehearsing them, which then allows them to put it into long-term memory and remember them. It could be consolidation. It may be taking that information and consolidating it and making it to where it's a little bit easier to access and get to. What's the most important thing you need out of that information? It could also be due to a mnemonic. Sometimes we create something to help us remember. A mnemonic was used for the cranial nerves. If you saw that on old Olympus mountain tops, a Viking grew vines and hops. Just ways to help you remember the order of things or something like that. Or any other trick that might work for you. Flashcards may be what you use. You may be a person that just reads over your notes constantly. The more you read over them, the more you're going to remember them. Okay? Now, one thing that's important in this class is don't cram. Don't sit there and cram for the test and then dump the information. That's short-term memory. You learned it for the test, you remembered it for a few hours, but then if I was to ask you later about it, you wouldn't remember it. That's not what you want here, because most of you are wanting to go into a medical field. Okay, which means that you need to be able to access this information. If you get into nursing school or medical school or something like that, and then they aren't going to cover this again, and they expect you to know the cranial nerves, or they expect you to know the cardiac cycle of the heart, they expect you to know what normal blood pressure is. They're not going to teach it to you again. You need to have that information up here. okay? That'll make it easier for you. Otherwise, you're going to have to relearn it and do more self-studying then, and then put it into long-term memory. So what you should do is work hard to put it into long-term memory now. Now, let me give you just a little tidbit. Only about 1% is transferred, and maybe that may be forgotten. If you transfer it to long-term memory, okay, you're not going to forget it. It's whether you can access it or not, okay? Sometimes it's harder to access the information. You're like, oh, I know I've seen that before. I know I remember it. It's in there. And sometimes, like during a stressful situation, like a test, you can't remember it. And then after the test, you're like, oh, it was that answer. I knew it all along. It was in there. We got to be able to access that information, okay? So the big thing is to learn the bigger concepts. And we may not remember all the little details about things, but if we can remember the big picture, we'll start to remember the little details over time. Okay, so as we go through here, especially when we talk about like hormones or different things like that, you're going to see some of this stuff over and over and over again. And so hopefully it'll start to go and be put into your long-term memory over time. Okay, and so this is why, and this was probably what we should cover first, just because of the whole idea of with studying. When you're studying, you need to study in a way that's not cramming. And you need to go through the process and find what's best and easiest for you to study the information to where you remember it. And you should study a little bit each day. If you'll study a little bit each day, you're going to remember it better than if you were to cram right before the exam. Okay, you may make a good grade on the exam, but now it's not in long-term memory. Okay, that's that whole idea of pumping it in your brain and then dumping it out thinking you don't need it. You're going to need this information again because most of you are going into the medical field. All right, so again, this is going to be the end of chapter 16. Where we're integrating a lot of that stuff in there. Chapter 17 is going to focus more on the special senses like vision, hearing, smell, taste. So we'll have a whole separate section for that. But I wanted you to kind of see how the brain is integrating all that together. How do we take those sensations that come in and cause a response to happen? And guys, that happens within seconds. Okay, it happens very, very quickly. So if you've got any questions or concerns as you're going through, please feel free to email me, contact me, and let me know what's kind of going on. If you need any extra help, let me know. All right, so happy studies.